Hi, everybody. Brad Truax from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And today we're going to talk about how animals navigate, or the subtitle, Animal GPS. We've always wondered, how does that loon pair return to the same nesting lake every year? How do the swallows return to Capistrano every year? How do monarch butterflies migrate to Mexico and back again? How do bats catch insects in the dark? How do owls find their prey in the dark? How do bees and wasps find their nests? How do dung beetles know the way back to their piles? How do hatchling turtles find their way to the sea? And how do sea turtles return to lay eggs in the very same spot that they were born many years prior? And how do salmon know to return to the site where they were born in order to spawn? How did lost dogs find their way home? And how did Mink the bear find her way back home from 120 miles away? These are all interesting questions about how animals are able to navigate. So, how do they navigate? There are actually several things that various animals use to navigate. Obviously, in some cases, there are innate mechanisms or instincts. In others, they use visual landmarks. They may use a sun compass or a star compass or a magnetic compass. They can use sounds, they can use smell, they can use chemical signals, pressure sensors, even gravity. And most species actually use a combination of these in order to navigate. So, using landmarks, you and I use landmarks to help us navigate all the time, and animals are no different. So when they're returning to a specific place, like a burrow or a nest, most animals do rely on landmarks, and they'll follow a sequence of landmarks that they observe during their outward journey, now in reverse order. And many different species have been shown to respond to landmarks, particularly when they're close to the vicinity of their nest or their burrow. Uh, the classic example is wasps. Dutch biologist Nico Tinbergen did this wonderful experiment many, many years ago. Basically, he put pine cones around a wasp nest entrance in the ground, and the wasps were continuing to find the hole in the ground where their nest was. Well, Tinbergen then moved the pine cones. He moved them to a different area. And now the wasp started looking for the entrance at the new location where the pine cones were. He actually switched markers several times and found that the wasp most strongly were drawn to dark three-dimensional markers rather than pale flat ones. But it was a classic example of demonstrating how the wasps actually were using landmarks to find their way back to the nest. Most animals develop a mental map in order to navigate, and the inputs to those maps include the sun, the stars, magnetic factors, gravity, odors, infrasound, which is frequencies less than about 20 hertz, and probably several other factors. Uh, some of the responses and the modalities that are used are innate. Uh, they're basically instinctual. Also, many, in fact, probably most animals learn to navigate from their parents. But in some, those instincts seem to play a role, so that some behaviors are present even before their parents are able to tell them how to navigate. Sea turtles find their way to the sea right after hatching. Migratory birds tend to possess an innate directional preference. Even birds that are raised in isolation will still orient in the appropriate direction for migration. So, how do birds migrate? They use a map and compass model for migration. Young birds will use information obtained during the outward journey, but for that first migration to that still unknown wintering area, the map step is replaced basically by a genetic program that makes them move in an innate direction for a certain period of time. Experienced birds, however, are able to truly navigate using some local site specific information, and they'll get back to their home region during migration back. Young birds of many species, particularly things like cranes and geese, will learn migration routes by following experienced adults during their first journeys. But others, like loon chicks, migrate after their parents have already left. So basically, they don't learn from their parents on what that navigation route is. Juvenile loons migrate, their migration may take up to 2 months compared to the 1 to 2 days that the adults use for migrating. Those juvenile loons, though, will do much better the next time they have to migrate because they've learned from that first migration. Many animals use the sun compass in order to determine direction, particularly during the daytime. The sun compass has been most often studied in birds like homing pigeons. And the sun compass, though, is also found in various crustaceans, various insect groups like ants and bees, beetles, spiders, butterflies like the monarch, marine snails, several species of fishes, lizards, snakes, turtles, and alligators. So you can see that there are many animals that, in fact, use a sun compass for migration. The sun compass is the most important orientation mechanism within the animal's home range, particularly over shorter distances, where animals will tend to follow the sun compass, even if there is contradicting information from their magnetic compass. More on the magnetic compass later on. The polarized light that comes from the sun is especially important in helping them migrate. So again, ants and bees use the sun to help them navigate back to their nest or hive. And Swiss physician Felix Sanche actually did an experiment where he put up a cover that prevented ants from seeing the sun. He then used a mirror to show the reflected sun in the opposite direction. And in fact, the ants totally changed their direction. They actually changed their direction 180 degrees and went back toward the reflection of the sun in the mirror. So again, that was a classic example proving that ants use the sun as a compass for migrating. Honeybees indicate to their colleagues by a dance the direction and distance to food sources, and they use polarization of sunlight to help them aid in migration. We'll show a nice video on that in a minute. And the bees use a time-compensated sun compass to take into account the fact that the sun's position is changing. The azimuth of the sun changes over time. So Karl von Frisch, who is an Austrian, he discovered how the honeybees tell each other about where the nectar is and how far away it is from the hive. Forager bees first look for nectar, and then they have to tell the rest of the hive how to find it. The forager bee then does a waggle dance and creates basically a diagram for the other bees. They use the sun as a reference point and the distance by the number of times it wags its abdomen. We'll show a video of that in a minute. So honeybees can also navigate by their sense of smell, the sun, the sky's pattern of polarized light, and some vertical landmarks that stand out, and possibly also the Earth's magnetic field. So they tend to search for their way home by orienting themselves in relation to several dominant landscape elements like water channels, roads, or edges of fields. So again, the forager bee first finds the source of the nectar, returns to the hive. The forager bee then does a figure 8-shaped waggle dance, which we'll show you in a minute, for the other bees to observe. And the orientation of that waggle dance tells all the other bees the angle from the sun that they should take in order to reach that nectar source. And the bees do use a time-compensated sun compass to take into account the changing azimuth of the sun. And the duration of the waggle actually conveys information about how far away the source of nectar is. And it's roughly 1 kilometer for every 1 second of the waggle. So let's go ahead and watch the video.
Aristotle was one of the first to document the intriguing behavior of honeybees. How is it, for instance, that a colony coordinates its workers' activity? What appears to be a random swarming mass of life may actually be intelligent behavior. A foraging honeybee will eventually discover a new food source, such as a freshly blooming flower or artificial feeder placed by a scientist. After this visit, an interesting thing happens. Over the next few minutes, many other bees arrive at the same location. They don't travel as a group. Instead, each bee finds the food source individually. How could these bees, who held no previous knowledge of this site, suddenly know precisely where the feeder was located? Is it possible that the animals communicate amongst themselves? To answer this question, Austrian biologist Carl von Frisch devised a series of experiments in the 1940s. Researchers at Georgia Tech have reproduced von Frisch's pioneering experiments using a modern observation hive. Two feeders are placed in different directions away from the hive. At each location, visiting honeybees are marked with a small spot of paint. A separate colour of paint is used at each station, so when a bee returns to the hive, it can easily be determined which feeding site it visited. Before von Frisch, other scientists had observed that returning bees tended to waggle about excitedly in a figure-8 pattern before sharing the collected pollen and nectar with their hive mates. In this two-station experiment, von Frisch noticed that the bees returning from the same feeding source danced differently from bees that arrived from the other location. While both sets of bees perform the classic figure-8 dance, the orientation of the dances is offset between the two groups. Bees returning from one feeder perform a rotated version of the dance done by the other bees. Incredibly, the angle of rotation precisely matches the angle between the feeding stations and the hive. This must be a clue to the mystery of how the bees are able to share information about the location of food. Through further experimentation, details of the grammar of the honeybee's dance language began to emerge. The dance exploits two fundamental tools available to the honeybee. First, their ability to see ultraviolet and polarized light allows them to determine the location of the sun at all times. Ultraviolet light is able to penetrate thick clouds or fog. Also, as light from the sun passes through the atmosphere, it's polarized in a direction towards the sun when viewed from the Earth. Devices like polarized film, sunglasses, or honeybee eyes can detect this orientation and determine the position of the sun even while looking in the opposite direction. This gives the bees a type of solar compass, allowing them to always know the precise position of the sun in the sky. A honeybee's entire environment seems to be constantly pointing towards the sun. In addition to this solar compass, bees possess a finely tuned internal clock. This clock is accurate enough for the bees to constantly estimate the new position of the sun as it travels across the sky. In this way, a honeybee can know the current orientation of the sun even after spending many hours within a dark hive. They can even take into account changes in seasons or latitudes. Inside of a dark vertically oriented beehive, the natural shared reference point is gravity, establishing both an up and a down direction. A bee's solar compass and internal clock provides another communal reference point, the sun. By pairing these two global constants, the bees form a simple language. Within the hive, the direction up, away from gravity, substitutes for the location of the sun. Then the angle that the bee dances compared to this up direction is the same angle a bee should fly away from the sun in order to find the target flower. So if the bee dances directly upward, other bees know that they can find flowers by flying directly towards the sun. If a bee dances 90 degrees to the left, then bees leaving the hive should fly 90 degrees to the left of the sun. A bee angling its dance towards the ground will let others know to fly directly away from the sun. As the day goes by, a bee will even use its internal clock to adjust for the movement of the sun in the sky. This lets fellow workers always know the correct direction to travel in order to find food. The central waggle section of the bee's dance also contains information about the distance to a food source. Longer time spent in this part of the dance means that the food is further away. Shorter durations mean that the food is closer by. In general, a bee increases the duration of this section by 1 second for every kilometer of distance to the food.
Pretty incredible, isn't it? Yeah. So once they found that nectar-rich flower that could be as far away as half a mile from the hive, how did they get back to the hive? Well, now they use some of those visual landmarks that we talked about. And there's a special emphasis on three-dimensional landmarks. So they can even make use of geometrical relationships between landmarks, especially their distance from the flower, to help them find their way back. And in addition, they may incorporate optical flow, polarized light, and scent marks into their navigation memory to help them return to the hive. Okay, so that's a little bit about the sun compass. Well, many animals also use the star compass. Again, humans have used the stars to navigate for millennia, and animals use it too. Compared to the sun compass, the star compass doesn't have to consider azimuth because Polaris, the North Star, is always in the same spot. It doesn't move through the night. And a star compass is used by birds that are migrating at nighttime. And some seals and some frogs use it. But it's not just the North Star. Very interestingly, dung beetles use the Milky Way rather than individual stars in order to navigate. A little bit more on how the scientists found that out later on. It was an elegant set of experiments that were done in a planetarium, and they found that the dung beetles did poorly when the Milky Way was not shown. So if they were just showing stars and the moon, but not the Milky Way, they weren't able to find their way back to where they were destined to go. So again, here's a dung beetle. Once again, they're using the Milky Way to navigate. And they also use a very photographic memory to store a mental map of the sky with the sun, the moon, and the stars. So again, here's the video that will show it. Note the clever little helmet that they've put on this dung beetle in order to prevent it from looking upward.
So how do dung beetles read the stars?
To farmers and ranchers, dung beetles are heroes because they keep soil enriched and move cattle droppings underground and away from the livestock. To feed their babies, dung beetles must push their pungent prize in a straight line, stretching up to 100 yards from where they started. But they sure don't have GPS. So how do they know how to get to where they're going? The stars. How did scientists learn this? Researchers began by tracking the movements of a control group of beetles that wandered around normally. The researchers affixed another group of dung beetles with little dung beetle hats. Yes, there are people who do this for a living. The hats covered the beetle's dorsal eyes, which are located on top of its head, while leaving their ventral eyes, which point toward the ground, uncovered. Even though the hat-wearing dung beetles could still see the ground, they wandered around in circles, completely lost. They needed to see the sky to get from dung to dung. To double-check their theory that dung beetles were using the stars to navigate, scientists took a bunch of beetles on a field trip to a planetarium. Once inside the planetarium, the scientists learned something even more amazing. It's not the bright light of the stars and moon that the dung beetles navigate relative to. It's actually the far dimmer glow of the Milky Way. Because whenever the Milky Way was covered up, the beetles were completely lost. So, what do dung beetles have in common with the great explorers? They navigate the stars and have the...
Again, that's a great story. So who else uses a star compass? Well, in Australia, billions of bogong moths will fly about 1,000 kilometers to a place they've never been before, the cool caves that are high in the Australian Alps. And they remain dormant there for the duration of the hot summer, and then they disperse again to breed in autumn, creating a new generation of moths. But some of the earlier studies that implicated geomagnetic fields and visual components to their migration were actually replaced by experiments that suggest that the visual navigation using the star compass is most important. Those experiments nullified the Earth's magnetic field using a special coil system, and they showed moths different images of the night sky and monitored specific parts of the moth's brains. And what they found was that certain neurons in the brains responded to changes in the orientation of the starry sky rather than the control image. Researchers still don't know which specific stellar objects they respond to, but quite clearly it has to take into account the rotation of the stars as the night wears on. And this is just showing the boggon moths. They only live for a year. They fly across Australia in the spring to avoid the hot weather. They go dormant in the caves, the cool caves that are in the western mountains. And that's where they breed, where they stay until they return and breed. And research clearly shows that they navigate using a stellar compass, basically navigate by the stars. Next most important is the magnetic compass. And there are many animals that use the direction of the Earth's geomagnetic field in order to navigate. Obvious advantage to that is that it's not sensitive to the time of day. It works even if there's darkness or bad weather conditions. And magnetite and possibly cytochromes, both of which contain iron atoms, are sensitive to the magnetic field. And these magnetite and cytochromes are found in many species. So again, many animals are using the direction of the geomagnetic field in order to navigate. And once again, we said that it has the advantage of the animal being able to navigate any time of day, even if it's dark or if it's bad weather. And they used experiments where coils were used to alter the magnetic fields, and it showed that birds altered their preferred directions in response to those changes in the magnetic field. And a magnetic compass has now been demonstrated in more than 20 bird species, including some birds that migrate and some birds that don't migrate. It's also been found in a whole host of other animal groups like cave salamanders, in fish like stingrays, salmons, eels, and others, in frogs, alligators, turtles, and mammals like rodents and bats, also in sea slugs, crustaceans like spiny lobsters, sandhoppers, insects like termites, beetles, moths, butterflies, honeybees, and ants. So again, quite clearly, the magnetic compass is widely used for navigation in the animal world. So a few animals use a polar compass, meaning that it's aligned with the poles, but most others actually use what's called an inclination compass, where the compass is aligned to the differences between the magnetic field at the pole versus the magnetic fields at the equator. So they're looking at a difference in the magnetic fields. And once again, magnetite, which is a special form of iron oxide, has clearly been identified as a key to the magnetic compasses in some birds and fish and some other species. And others have speculated about the role of cytochromes because cytochromes do have a central iron atom. Some cytochromes are present in retinal cells in certain species, and they've been identified as possible magnetoreceptors that might be important for navigation. So the Earth's geomagnetic field, the North Pole has been shifting for many years. It's a shift away from Canada towards Siberia, and it's accelerated in recent years. And the shift has been increasing by about 6 miles per year to a peak of about 31 miles annually by the 2000s. However, in the last 5 years, the rate of movement has slowed somewhat to about 22 miles per year. And those shifts probably have very little impact on short-term travel. But if you're a turtle who's been roaming the ocean for 15 years, and you're now looking to come back to your natal site to lay your eggs, that shift may make you miss the exact site that you were returning to. So how do birds navigate? Again, many birds use that magnetite-based receptors in their beaks to sense the magnetic fields, and then they use that to navigate. Once again, magnetite is found in nerve terminals in the beak of many birds, and it acts like a tiny compass needle, giving birds information about their position relative to the Earth's magnetic fields. Birds also have specialized cells in their eyes that seem to sense magnetic fields, and that may be related to those cytochromes that we talked about. But they also use landmarks and celestial clues and smell to help them navigate. So once again, that question we asked at the beginning, how do loon pairs return to the same lake year after year? Well, we know that the loons migrate to the seacoast each fall, and then they return to the same freshwater lake in the spring. And they do use a combination of factors. That some of those are innate or instinctual, others are learned behaviors utilizing landmarks, and some potentially use the Earth's magnetic field in order to come back, basically using a magnetic compass. And they often return to the very specific lake where they were hatched. That's called natal habitat imprinting. And they may also respond to things, characteristics like the size of the lake and the pH of the water. The swallows of Capistrano, every year around October 23rd, leave San Juan Capistrano, and they fly 6,000 miles to Argentina. And every year on or about March 19th, they return to San Juan Capistrano in California. And they reclaim their old nests in the ancient arches and walls of the mission that's located in Capistrano. That's where they raise their young. So again, what triggers bird migration? Well, in most cases, it's photoperiod, basically the length of daylight. That photoperiod also triggers some hormonal changes that help the birds actually get ready for the migration. Remember, if you're going to fly 6,000 miles, you have to have enough energy to be able to make that long migration. But there are other factors like temperature, food availability, barometric pressure, all of which may influence the timing of migration. And again, climate change has reduced some of the cues that loons use to tell them when to migrate. As a result, we've seen that some of the loons are staying longer in the north. Then they get stranded in ponds or lakes that get iced over. And if you remember from our videos on loons, they typically need about a quarter mile in order to be able to take off. That's because they can only take off from the water. So climate change has resulted in many more loons becoming stranded and iced over lakes in the winter. The homing pigeons have a very interesting story. Again, they can find their way home from 100 miles away. And even if they're released in an unfamiliar territory or separated from any companions that they might have, they still consistently find their way back. They seem to have an internal compass that's sensitive to the Earth's geomagnetic field, again, a magnetoreceptor. And they use that to maintain their orientation and direction, even when there are no visual clues that are present. And they also use their sense of smell, and they'll create odor maps to also help them migrate. And they also use visual maps in order to identify some familiar landmarks. And there are probably some specific genes that influence their ability to orient and navigate. Experience certainly helps. They do much better if they are doing a repeated flight. But it's interesting that, again, they're using a mix of environmental cues. They use the sun, the stars, the Earth's geomagnetic field in order to help them migrate from hundreds of miles away. And they probably also, interestingly, respond to sound, like ocean waves. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, how scientists found that out. Hummingbirds have an incredible memory. Hummingbirds feed on 1,000 to 2,000 flowers for nectar every day. And they don't just randomly visit these flowers. They actually do a practice called trap lining. That's basically a memorized route that connects them to feeding locations in a sequence. So they visit that same sequence of flowers in a remarkably consistent way each day. And fledgling hummingbirds don't learn much about foraging from their parents. So when they first start out, their initial foraging is very inefficient, and they'll kind of visit flowers in a random fashion. But within just 2 to 3 weeks after they leave the nest, they become much more adult-like in their memory patterns. And it's very interesting. The hippocampus, which is that part of the brain that deals with memory, whether in animals or in humans, is disproportionately large in the hummingbirds compared to other birds. So that probably accounts for this incredible memory that they have that allows them to follow that same sequence of visiting flowers on a daily basis. The monarch butterfly story, many of you have heard. Monarch butterflies migrate thousands of miles each year between North America and Mexico. They're really the only butterflies known to make two-way migration. And they use a combination of air currents and thermals and their eyes in order to navigate. And they also have antennae that have a genetic clock that helps them know when to navigate and when to migrate. Some Canadian researchers worked with multiple volunteers, both in Canada and the US, to determine how the monarch butterflies migrate. They applied small paper tags to more than 300,000 monarchs. And the butterflies that were tagged east of the Rocky Mountains headed south into Texas, then over the border into Mexico, where they spend the winter. And in the spring, they have a mating frenzy and they start to fly northward. Many of the males have died off along the way. The females, once they reach the southern US, will lay their eggs on milkweed plants and then they die. But the caterpillars then hatch from those milkweed plants. They feed on the milkweed and eventually pupate. And then a whole new generation of adult butterflies emerges and flies further north. So they reach New Hampshire, for instance. And once again, the females lay their eggs once they reach their northern destination. And at the end of the summer, the last brood of adult butterflies, which actually is now either the fourth or fifth generation, once again heads back south to Mexico. So it's a fascinating story. Again, millions of monarch butterflies winter in Mexico. They usually go into forests that are at altitudes that are about 3,000 meters. So that's pretty darn high. And they enjoy cool but stable conditions there. They fly as much as 2,200 miles over a period of 75 days. So roughly 30 miles a day in order to reach that destination. And the weight of all these butterflies in a tree can actually cause those trees to bend. So a fascinating story. And further research shows that the butterflies are using a time-compensated sun compass as their primary navigation tool. But they probably also have a non-celestial backup process, such as a magnetic compass, probably based on the Earth's geomagnetic field. And it's probably an inclination compass as opposed to a polar compass. And it probably also is based on light-sensitive receptors in their antennae. And that's a backup mechanism when directional cues are not available from the sky. They also use landscape features like either the Rocky Mountains or the open water of the Gulf of Mexico as physical barriers, which basically funnel the butterfly steadily toward southern Texas and Mexico. And still unclear what actually brings them to that very circumscribed area in Mexico where they actually spend the winter. Turtles have a very interesting story. Much of the research has been done on olive ridley turtles. They lay their eggs on the shore, and eventually the hatchlings emerge from their nest in the sand and have to make their way to the ocean. And their first challenge is getting safely into the sea without becoming prey to raccoons or crabs, foxes, or other predators. So it's important that they find the shortest route to the edge of the water. We're going to see a little video here of all these turtles hatching and making their way to the sea. Actually, only about 1 in 1,000 of these turtles actually make it to maturity. So there you saw hundreds of turtles that had just hatched, and they're all making their way to the sea. So how do they find their way to the sea? Well, they probably use several different cues. They look at the natural light of the horizon over the ocean, the reflection of the moonlight on the water, the white crests on the waves, and the actually slope of the beach toward the sea is one of the things that helps them get there. And they also have an instinctual drive that makes them move toward the water. So basically, they also imprint their natal beach, because we're going to see later they will return years later to that same beach in order to lay their eggs. So again, about 15 years later, they will return to that same site to lay their eggs. An incredible story. And scientists believe that they use the Earth's magnetic field to map their route, and each beach, therefore, has a unique magnetic fingerprint that the turtles are actually remembering. Incredible story. So again, they use that light of the horizon, the slope of the beach, etc., to find their way to the water. It's interesting. We were just in the Galapagos, and there was one beach in one of the Galapagos Islands where the Natural Park Service was using some artificial lights to help guide the hatchling turtles in the correct direction. Very interesting. And once the turtles reach the water, now they have to battle the breaking waves, and they have to escape some marine predators that might be lying in the shallow water. And it turns out that the initial impetus for the direction is the direction of the waves rather than their magnetic compass. But eventually, that magnetic compass takes over and basically helps them navigate over the next 15 years. So here's what happens. Once they reach the water, they're swept up in the Gulf Stream. They're taken northward. They end up doing about a 9,000-mile journey, and it takes them around the entire North Atlantic basin. Once they get up to the northern reaches, they get into the current of the North Atlantic Gyre, which brings them back down south and brings them back to within striking distance of the very beach where they were originally hatched. Now remember, that 9,000-mile journey may take as long as 15 years. And basically, they're using that magnetic field both to keep them within the North Atlantic Gyre and to get them close to their original site of hatching. And those magnetic characteristics of the beach where they were born is really a key factor in telling the female turtles to lay their eggs basically in the spot where they had been born 15 years earlier. Just an incredible journey. Same thing happens with salmon. How does salmon know where to spawn? Well, you'll recall that salmon come back to the very stream where they were born in order to spawn, because they know it's a pretty good place to spawn. And they use microscopic crystals of magnetite that's in tissue in their body as both a map and a compass to help them navigate using the Earth's geomagnetic field. And once they reach the mouth of the river that took them to the ocean, now they'll swim upstream to spawn at the very exact location where they originally hatched. And that journey up the river tends to be driven by olfactory and chemical signals rather than their geomagnetic compass. Red foxes have an interesting story. Many of you will remember this from our videos on red foxes. They have an uncanny ability to find prey that's underneath the snow. They have very keen sense of hearing that helps them locate that prey as far as 2 car lengths away. And they use the Earth's geomagnetic field to help them hunt in the snow. Many of their leaps into the snow come up empty. But here are the exact numbers. If the fox aligns with 20% off geomagnetic north, it's successful 74% of the time at coming up with its prey. Whereas in all other directions, they're successful only 18% of the time. So quite clearly, they are using a geomagnetic compass to actually help them hunt. And this video, I'm not going to play the whole thing.
I cherish peace with all my heart, no matter how many people I need to kill to get it.
Sorry for the
Time
commercial.
to save the world.
You ready for the next adventure?
The fox. This clever canine has an amazing set of skills. Deep snow covers the black hills of the Dakotas, and hidden under that icy blanket, field mice are stirring. The odds of catching anything might seem hopeless, but not to him. An enormous leap to catch a critter under 3 feet of snow.
So there you have it. And once again, they're very successful if they're oriented in the correct direction, and not successful if they're oriented in the wrong direction. Okay, how did lost dogs find their way home? Well, again, there are stories that are incredible. In 2015, a pup made a 35-mile trek home after it had run away during a hike in San Diego. A beagle returned to Winnipeg, Manitoba, 6 weeks after it had been separated from its family, about 50 miles away. And way back in 1924, there was a collie that got separated from its family during a road trip, and basically made a 2,800-mile trek that took 6 months and crossed multiple mountain ranges to get back to home. So how did they do it? Well, National Geographic also said that dogs make mental maps just like we do. And unlike we humans, most of their mental maps are dominated by smells and scents. A dog's sense of smell is 10,000 to 100,000 times more sensitive than ours is. But that's not the whole story. So there was a study that was done in 2000. The scientists put GPS trackers and cameras on the dogs, and they released them basically into an unfamiliar forested area. And 60% of the time, the dogs use their sense of smell to retrace their steps and sniff their way back to where their handlers were. But about 30% took a novel route that began by running a short distance along the north-south axis, regardless of where their handler was actually located. And actually, some of these dogs reached their handler faster than those that were using scent alone. So without any familiar visual clues to draw from, these study dogs were likely using a magnetic compass. Very interesting. And again, the conclusion was that the dogs may pair their mental map with the magnetic field in order to orient themselves when they get lost. How about cats? Well, cats are very good at finding their way home. They create scent trails by rubbing their faces or spraying objects, and that helps them navigate. And they have an incredible hearing and sharp vision that also helps aid them with both orientation and navigation. And scientists believe that iron deposits in their ears and their skin help them sense the Earth's geomagnetic field. So they're also using a magnetic compass. How about Mink the bear? Many of you remember Mink the bear was located in Hanover, New Hampshire, and named after Mink Brook. And back several years ago, Mink was causing some concern. So officials basically, they were going to euthanize her. And the media got wind of that and made a big stink about it. And Governor Sununu eventually pardoned Mink the bear. So basically, they relocated mink to bear 120 miles north, up near the Canadian border. And within a year, she actually found her way back to Hanover. Her tracking collar showed her looping back and forth about 1,000 miles in total. And she crossed Interstate 91 and the Connecticut River multiple times. She traveled about 30 miles a day. And she was eventually able to find her way back to her home range due to her knowledge of the area and probably instinct, which is very common for bears. And like other animals, bears do use a range of cues for long distance navigation. And that includes a keen sense of smell, ability to identify landmarks, and potentially a sensitivity to Earth's geomagnetic field, though the latter has not been proven in bears. Her internal map obviously was powerful enough that it got her all the way back to her familiar territory near Dartmouth College. An incredible story. This is basically a map that's showing Mink's travels. Again, remember she had a tracking collar on, and scientists were able to track her. So here she was, where they dropped her off here in the northern part of the state, and eventually she wandered around, got into Vermont, crisscrossed both I-91 and the Connecticut River several times, and eventually got back to her home territory in Hanover, New Hampshire. So really a great story. When I look at this, I think basically this is the direction of the Connecticut River, and I suspect that she was probably following the flow of the water in the Connecticut River. And again, once she got a little bit closer, she started to use some visual and scent clues that also helped her get back. So again, she crisscrossed Interstate 91 and Connecticut River lots of times and was traveling about 30 miles a day and eventually got back. And the bottom just shows a video of Mink. So again, Mink was loved by many people in the Hanover region. She was quite the bear.
I'm sorry, I definitely want to watch this.
When she died, they determined she was probably about 30 years old, and she probably had made multiple cubs. So her legacy obviously lives on long after she's died. Okay, how about things in the dark? Both bats and owls hunt at night. There are certainly some other animals that hunt at night, but bats and owls are the ones that we think about the most. Neither really has bad eyesight, but it's also very difficult to see at night. So how do they do it? Well, they do it in different ways. Bats do it via echolocation, which we'll talk about in a minute. Owls do it by focusing on sounds that are made by their prey. So again, sound cues are used by many animals to help them navigate. The sound of breaking waves on rocks is different from that of waves that are breaking on other surfaces. Bats use echolocation. Some blind people also use echolocation when they're navigating. And some even use the Doppler effect. Remember, the Doppler effect is that sound differs depending on whether it's coming toward you or whether it's going away from you. And some will use the Doppler effect to determine direction. And sonar and echolocation are also used by dolphins, porpoises, and certain whales. And infrasound, which is basically very low frequency sounds, probably less than about 20 hertz, are below the threshold for human hearing, but infrasound can be dissipated far more slowly and travel over thousands of miles. And there are some animals who actually respond to infrasound. Echolocation basically is a form of biological sonar. Okay, just like submarines emit a sound and they look at the echo of the sound bouncing off it, animals are basically doing the same thing. And bats especially use echolocation to detect their prey. And some whales and porpoises also use echolocation. So the bats again, emit ultrasonic sounds to produce echoes. Usually, if they're just cruising, they're just sending out sounds at about 10 bursts per second. But if they're hunting, they send out sounds at 200 bursts per second. And they can even vary the wavelength of those sounds that they send out. And they can use the Doppler effect. And this really allows them to construct an incredible image of their environment, even though their vision is limited because of the darkness at night. Well, barred owls are, again, they're raptors and they hunt at night. They have very keen eyesight, but again, you can't see very well in the dark. So they have excellent hearing, which helps them in their hunting abilities. They have asymmetrical ears that allow them to better localize sounds. And they also have a facial disc that's made of feathers that kind of acts like a satellite dish. It focuses sound to their ears and amplifies them. So again, this is showing that facial disc, again, composed of feathers around their head. And they can raise these disc feathers slightly to help them direct the sound to their ears. So the combination of the facial disc and the asymmetrical ears really helps them precisely locate the location of their prey. So you can do this. If you cup your hands over your ears, you will actually hear that sounds become louder and clearer. And that's exactly what the barred owls are doing. So again, in terms of that infrasound that I mentioned before, there was very interesting observation that was made in homing pigeons. A geophysicist noted he was following pigeon races, and he found several instances where the pigeons in the races never arrived at their destinations. And he wondered what the cause of that was. And he was able to trace those failures to times when they would have been exposed to infrasound that was generated by the Concorde supersonic transport aircrafts. They're very interesting. So other sensory cues are also used to help animals navigate. Some fish have a series of pressure-sensitive pores along their sides, and that helps. They're sensitive to movements in the water around them. And even blind fish can sense pressure waves that are generated by their own motion. And that helps them detect the presence or location of objects that are around them. River otters use their sensitive whiskers to assess movement and tell them where their prey might be, even though they're swimming in very murky waters where they can't see very well. And beavers dig what we call benthic canals underwater, and that helps them feel their way along the bottom of the water to get to either their dam or their lodge or the side of the river so they can actually cut down some trees. So they can swim basically in very murky water where they wouldn't be able to see very well. Fish use multiple modalities to navigate. Some fish have, we mentioned, have pressure waves that are generated by their own motion, and that helps them detect objects around them. And other fish use visual cues to identify landmarks. We mentioned before that the salmon and other fish that spawn use geomagnetic clues to get them near the mouths of their natal rivers, and then they switch over to use olfactory clues to get them to their very original birthplaces. And some fish, like electric eels and some sharks, actually use electrical landmarks to help them navigate. Many animals do use the sense of smell in order to identify prey and other senses of food. One scientist put forth a hypothesis that each stream contains a particular bouquet of fragrances that the salmon become imprinted to, and that helps them eventually identify their natal tributary when they're returning from the sea in order to spawn. Some fish follow a series of olfactory waypoints during their journeys up and down the river. And some oceanic birds rely on olfactory clues, even though they may be using other clues and cues in order to navigate. And some bees also use olfactory clues, particularly in getting back to their hive after they went out and found their source of nectar. Uh, Many animals, again, because of that keen sense of smell, use scent trails to help them navigate. So again, we mentioned that cats use scent trails. They rub their faces or spray on objects, and then they're able to smell that, and that helps them develop a mental navigation map. Ants lay down chemical trails using chemicals called pheromones, which help them find their way back to the nest. And again, we mentioned before that dogs have an exceptional sense of smell, and they can detect scents for very great distances. And again, we mentioned that salmon can use their very key sense of smell to help recognize the unique chemical makeup of their birthplace. The penguin story really tells us the whole story because penguins use a whole series of modalities to help them get around and survive. You know, the penguins in Antarctica migrate hundreds or thousands of miles every year. Yet they always return precisely to their original feeding grounds and specific breeding colonies. So, how do they do it? Well, they use a combination of celestial clues, geomagnetic sensing, olfactory navigation, visual landmarks, and even sound mapping. The sun compass is an innate ability to track the sun's position throughout the day, and that can be used as a directional guide. But if you remember, that's not going to do you very good if you're in polar winter when there's very little sun to see. So they have to use something else. And there are several penguin species that navigate by the stars. And again, that's pretty amazing since they have to account for seasonal changes in the night sky and the rotation of the sky, the stars through the night. Remember, Antarctica is in the southern hemisphere, so they don't have the North Star to orient to. Uh, but the penguins also use magnetoreception in order to navigate. Again, they have magnetite particles that have been found in the tissue of some penguin species, particularly near their beaks and eyes. And that's particularly important when factors related to the terrain or the weather, things like fog and darkness, or simply the vast expanse of the ocean or the ice sheets prevent them from reliably using landmarks, the sun or the stars. And they'll use olfactory clues like the very distinctive smell of krill blooms or phytoplankton. And there's probably a unique signature of their home colony that's created by the guano that's there and other biological materials, and perhaps even some oceanic odor landscapes. And remember, in the Antarctica, there are very vast ice shelves that would be a whiteout for us, but the penguins are actually able to recognize some landscape materials that help them. And they may also respond to acoustic signals, particularly when they're underwater. So again, like many of the birds that we spoke about earlier, penguins probably also have some innate or instinctual navigational preferences, but they do learn migratory patterns. So again, the first time that they're migrating, they typically take routes that are not very efficient, but they will improve their navigation with each subsequent journey. So they can learn from that original first migration. And young penguins often make their first migrations simply by following their experienced adults. And that allows them to memorize the routes and the landmarks and other environmental cues. And that helps them successfully complete their journey on the way back. And they can detect ocean currents, and they'll often ride these in order to conserve energy. And they can detect thermoclines that also help indicate good feeding areas. So again, they're even great weathermen. They can often time their migrations to coincide with the best weather conditions. So they can detect changes in barometric pressure. So they can essentially sense when there's an approaching weather system that might affect their ability to migrate. So the bottom line, it's pretty rare for any animal to navigate by using only a single modality. And the penguins are a great example of how animals actually use multiple modalities to get around. So that's a little bit about how animals navigate. It would be nice if we had the same ability to navigate and didn't have to use our GPS watches and other things to get around. But it's a great story. Hope you got something out of this.